Edelman Trust Barometer in partnership with the Marketing Institute of Ireland and the Institute of Directors. The Trust Barometer is a study of 33,000 people in 28 countries, and we look at trust in the institutions of government, business, media, and NGOs. So, turning to this year's data, and as we take tentative steps forward with the vaccination programme picking up, this morning, we want to explore how best we might renew our economy and society. Over the next hour, we are going to look at 4 areas of opportunity. Firstly, the opportunity to reimagine globalization. Secondly, the opportunity to renew trust on the island of Ireland. Thirdly, the opportunity to tackle the infodemic of misinformation. And finally, the opportunity to build a bridge between public health and economic wellness. And you will see through the findings of the barometer, it highlights the need to make progress in all of these areas. To help me explore these areas, I am joined by our panelists. They include Lord Jim O'Neill. Jim is an economist and former chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management. Andrea Catherwood is a BBC Radio 4 broadcaster and documentary maker, and Paul Reid is chief executive of the HSE. The format for the discussion is that I will present a number of insights from the barometer, and then I will go to the panel for their perspectives. So in the spirit of how best to renew our economy and society, I first want to look at whether there is an opportunity to reimagine globalization. Over 30 years, it has brought enormous benefits, but there is also an increasing reality of inequality. We see this inequality in our data. This slide shows that the informed public, who are better educated and more affluent, have higher levels of trust compared to the rest of the population. If you look to the right of this slide, you will see the trust gap between these groups on a country-by-country basis. About 3/4 of the way down, you will see that Ireland's more affluent are more trusting by a margin of 15 points. It's not unique to Ireland. There is a double-digit trust inequality in a record number of countries that you're looking at on this slide. And so what we are really seeing here is a case of the trust haves and have-nots. Alongside this sense of inequality, the barometer is telling us that people are getting more concerned around foundational or structural issues that impact our society. The data shows that in comparison to last year, people want more urgent action on a range of issues, from improving our healthcare system to dealing with issues like poverty, fake news, climate, racism, and closing our economic and social divide. People also expect more from business, which is now being asked to accompany its traditional competency of profit-making with solving problems in society. 64% want CEOs to lead on this agenda, while 67% believe that CEOs should be more accountable to the public and not just to their board or shareholders. The message here is that business now has to be in step with what society expects. So I'm going to take down our slides here and turn to our panel. And Jim, I'm going to start with you. You're very welcome. It's great to have you with us this morning. The findings show increasing trust inequality, a demand for structural issues to be prioritized, and a potential new societal role for business. Is all of this pointing to a need for globalization to evolve in a more inclusive way?
Thanks very much for having me, Joe. It's a delight to be here, and congratulations to Edelman for its continued leadership with its trust barometer. It's something that I've followed for some years now, and it's very good to see. I guess my honest answer is linked to many things going on at the moment. Who knows where aspects of the world, including globalization, will go. I think it's dangerous to have too confident of views. But that said, as you and I chatted about in the build-up for this last week or so, you know, I would start by actually giving you a bit of a contradictory answer. First of all, it seems to me globalization is constantly evolving. The notion that it always follows one steady path is probably a bit silly. And I would add in that regard, I'm right in the middle of hosting a Chatham House event that I chair which involves all the world's major pharmaceutical companies. And I can't think of a better example of globalization actually thriving as a result of the need that we go through. And I start with that and a possible contradiction, because to some extent, the way globalization evolves is in fact ultimately what society needs of them. And the contradiction which touches at the heart of your survey is, and it's something I've adapted my own views on, partly because of Brexit here in the UK, and also looking at the Trump phenomenon, is that I think a lot of countries and companies perhaps probably need to start thinking of globalization as, and international trade as, not an end goal in itself, but an extension of whatever their own domestic economic and social policy has been. And for too long, many companies and countries have been attracted to the goal of being big at something in the world, purely because it was being big in something in the world, as opposed to how that related to their own people. And I think we're in the early days of going through a big evolution of that.
Is it the case, Jim, of countries then doing globalization on their own terms? I mean, the Chinese have done that very effectively in Southeast Asian countries. Is that a potential model that countries need to look at their own domestic policies and operate and embrace globalization, but on their own terms?
I mean, again, it's tricky. I mean, sort of re-emphasizing the earlier part of my last point. I mean, ultimately, globalization continues and evolves because what all 7 billion plus of us want as consumers, we want to be able to get whatever it is at any moment in time we want, generally from the most reliable place we can get it and at the most affordable price, by and large. And so, you know, I don't think one should lose sight of that. But when it comes to making sure it suits beyond, you know, the attraction for a policymaker or a company, I think it needs to be done as an active pursuit by a country in particular as to what will that do for my own country's productivity. You know, buried in not wanting to turn this into a Brexit focus, but as I often point out to some of my esteemed colleagues of the economics profession, as positive as being in the EU seems to have been for the UK from a trade perspective, it didn't really do anything for solving our persistent decline in productivity. And dealing with the productivity issues and putting trade in that context, in my opinion, would be a much better path for the UK, indeed, probably for many countries around the world.
Paul, I'm going to come to you next. And again, it's fantastic to have you with us. I want to acknowledge the incredible work that the HSE has been doing over the past year. It's coming through in our data. The HSE is one of the most trusted institutions this year. When we look at this idea of globalization and inequality, and if we look at the health services here, Paul, has the pandemic laid the foundations for some new thinking in how health services might be provided in the years ahead?
Yeah, good morning, Joe, and thanks for the invite, and good morning to all your participants this morning. My next engagement is a few hours in front of the Joint Oireachtas Committee, so hopefully this grilling is not as what one of the newspaper said this morning. I'm in for a bruising grilling, so hopefully this isn't as bruising. But yeah, I think, look, thanks for your comments, and like Jim just said, in terms of your own barometer, we now very closely follow the HSE data around trust, confidence, around the HSE in particular over the last year, and watching very closely how it's improving, and it has been, which is, you know, if there's any upside from COVID and the virus of last year, we are seeing increasing levels of trust from the public for the HSE. Specifically to your questions just around reimagining or relooking at how we deliver health services, yes, I think it would be a shame if we don't lose some of the real benefits of what we have seen in terms of delivery of health services in Ireland this year. And there's a few things I would draw out in particular. One, I think from the public's perspective, they and we have this in the data, they experienced a more unified health voice coming to them. So it wasn't as fractious as we are traditionally experienced. So, you know, consultants having a go of the health service, GPs at war with the health service, we're at war with someone else. So over the course of the year, I think we've heard the public trusting. So I think there is one big lesson for us around how we engage with the public in a more coherent way, for definite. But the delivery of the health services, yes, I think is going to, I think it's something all health services all across the world should relook at now. I mean, I've spent time, you know, at some stage in my career, I spent 1.5 years working with Trocra all across the world in, you know, really developing countries. And I experienced there, you know, the real impacts of not having a health service. And, you know, so sometimes when we come in the developing world to criticize a health service, we need to, you know, really look at some of the problems across the world as well. So I think from a global perspective, and Ireland has a good tradition, we need to continue that tradition of showing our interest in health systems across the world. And that comes to vaccines too. But specifically back to your question related to Ireland here, I think we've done things differently between ourselves, having GPs working with the service much differently, having the private health system and a public health system working in a very different way, delivering services in a way that the emergency department is not, which traditionally has been the first port of call for healthcare. So trying to deliver services outside of the acute and hospital system. So I think globally at an operation level and equally at a public and private perspective, we need to learn.
And Andrea, I'm just going to bring you in here, and it's great to have you with us as well. Just picking up Paul's theme of doing things differently, and returning to the idea of globalization and the need for it to evolve. I wanted to ask you, as an experienced financial journalist, about the role of financial media in that evolution of globalization. Do financial media need to hold businesses accountable to a set of standards other than just financial performance?
Joe, that's a very interesting idea, and I'm delighted to be here today. The Edelman Trust Barometer is something that in my industry we look at every year, and we kind of look forward to its findings. So thank you very much for that. In terms of what journalists, particularly financial journalists, are doing when they're looking at companies, I think that it has been evolving over time. You know, this idea of responsible capitalism, the idea that there's another bottom line, and that journalists are looking at the environmental impact, the health and well-being, not only of a company's employees, but what's happening in its whole global supply chain, is becoming increasingly, it's relevant to investors. Now, that's not to say that investors don't still want value, but it is becoming relevant to investors and also relevant to consumers. So because of that, I think financial journalists are and increasingly will be asking questions that well, that reflect the concerns of their audience and their readership, because that's often what drives this. Social media has also made changes because brands, particularly consumer-facing brands, are much more concerned that if they don't, if they have bad publicity around their supply chain, that can really affect them and affect their bottom line. I mean, we've seen FT journalists doing big investigations into British factories in Leicester, making clothes extremely cheaply, and the conditions in those places were really the kind of thing that you might have expected to see happening in Bangladesh or in Pakistan. That makes a massive difference to a company's bottom line. And I think that more and more as consumers and as investors are thinking about all forms of responsible capitalism, that really does change the conversation for journalists. And that's certainly the direction of travel.
And we are going to come back to discuss the role of journalists in more detail later on in the conversation. For now, I just want to return to our overall theme of renewing our society. And I want to look at one of the critical components of that, which is trust on the island of Ireland and with Britain. The protocol, as we know, has created uncertainty in Northern Ireland, not seen since before the Good Friday Agreement. I want to explore the implications of this, particularly in relation to the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. Firstly, through our data, we looked at the impacts that recent events have had on our relationship with Britain. You can see on this slide that trust in Britain amongst people in the Republic is quite low at 33%. The majority, or 63%, are putting this down to the way in which the Brexit negotiations were managed. In Northern Ireland, the management of the pandemic by the UK government has stoked some negative sentiment around the Union. 33% of people north of the border say it has made them more in favour of breaking away from the UK. We took a look at the attitudes to the Union south of the border, and you can see the results on this slide. If I can draw your attention to the first two pillars on the left, they show that over 50% are in favour of a border poll and a united Ireland, but there is a significant number of undecideds at 30%, and 4 in 10 would only favour it if there was unionist agreement. We looked at the reasons for and against a united Ireland. On the left, we have the reasons for. History plays a big role, as you would expect. Over 60% are in favour on the basis that historically Ireland has been one country. Brexit is also significant. Over 40% say it has made a united Ireland more likely. You can see the reasons against on the right. 66% cite violence, but financial concerns also have a bearing. 60% are more concerned about the cost, 50% say it would impact public services, and 45% believe we are more prosperous without Northern Ireland. So I want to return to our panel for their perspectives on this. And Andrea, can I turn to you first? You are from Northern Ireland. You understand the realities on the ground. What are the issues to consider for Northern Ireland, particularly in relation to its constitutional status?
Well, first of all, it's really interesting to see those figures and particularly to think a little bit more perhaps about the South. Brexit has been a game changer for Northern Ireland, and there's no question about that. As I'm sure you know, the majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain within the EU. People in Northern Ireland were much more aware of the implications of the Good Friday Agreement beforehand, and there is a trust deficit in Northern Ireland on both sides because they listened to the Leave campaign, to Boris Johnson and others saying that the border simply wouldn't matter. And they knew that that wasn't the case. And of course, it's proved that that wasn't the case. So that has been very damaging for trust within Great Britain and Northern Ireland and that relationship. However, in terms of the constitutional implications of this, what is also important to say is that unlike Scotland, the conditions for a change in the constitutional position of Northern Ireland are enshrined in international law in the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that that is really important. We know the mechanism for which a border poll would be called. And that mechanism is that it would be called by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. It's very clear. He can decide a poll, and if he thinks that the majority of people in Northern Ireland would like to change their constitutional position, i.e. leave Britain and become part of a reunified Ireland. Now, there is, of course, a degree of uncertainty around that because it doesn't actually say under what grounds he would have to call that poll. So it's just if he felt that. And I mean, there's been calls for clarification. There have been legal challenges to try and get clarification, but we just don't know exactly what that would be. You know, would it be lots of border polls, just lots of a polling opinion? Would it be another, a move in Stormont that really enshrined a major nationalist majority? We're very close to that now, as you know. We're not sure, but what I can say is politically in the UK at the moment, it is only the Secretary of State that can call that border poll. Sinn Féin can't call the border poll, Stormont can't call the border poll, and Dublin can't call the border poll. And I think that's really important to know. At the moment, politically, there is no appetite for this government to do that, none. And there will be no appetite for it while Scotland's constitutional position is still unknown. So, you know, in London, in Westminster, and it was Westminster that has the power, they're looking at Scotland. That's the prize. They don't want this union to split up. And the last thing they're going to do is call a border poll in Northern Ireland when that is therefore going to put so much pressure on them to hold one in Scotland. So for the moment, I think that it is, I'm not saying, I think the direction of travel is that there will be a border poll in Northern Ireland, and it's enshrined in international law. But I do think we're looking at a 10-year time frame rather than one coming up to 2024, the next election in the UK. And I also think that it's worth remembering that Westminster is looking at Scotland as well as Northern Ireland and as well as the Republic of Ireland. The last thing I'd say on this is that it is inconceivable, however, that the Secretary of State would call that border poll, in my opinion, without a lot of discussion with Dublin first. This is not going to come as a surprise. There isn't going to be a snap border poll. If we've learned anything from Brexit, is that we need to know what we're voting on.
So ultimately, it's a political decision. On the economics of this, can I come to you, Jim? How do we create a situation in Northern Ireland where job creation and opportunity becomes the antidote to many of the political and sectarian challenges that are present in Northern Ireland?
Nice, easy question for me, Joe. Thank you. Fascinating to listen to this discussion and Andrea's comments. Wow. You know, that's the €1 trillion or £1 trillion question, indeed, for the world. You know, I am going to give you the stock answer that economists and others should. If you look at many troubled hotspots of the world, there is usually a pretty common denominator of very low levels of income, great perceptions of unfairness about opportunity to do with economic well-being. And you look at the few places in our lifetime that have escaped it. And by the way, obviously, Ireland itself has made huge progress during my lifetime. The answer is in economic progress. And I hesitate in trying to think of the right words and how to choose the next part of what I say. You know, I think ultimately individual people, as much as they obviously have great pride in their nationality and national status, this would be, maybe you've done it. Here's a suggestion for you, Joe, with your poll. Maybe you should delve further as to what people would value more, because my hunch is that you know, people want progress for themselves and their children and their futures, and would probably value that above some of these more highly emotive things, which often have roots in aspects of history to do with, I emphasize, aspects of the national issue. But and I think the way to solve it is through undertaking things to boost people's economic fortunes.
Could I put that to you, maybe, Andrea? Like, is there a growing middle ground in Northern Ireland who are less caught up in identity and history, and perhaps are more concerned about some of the things Jim has talked about there, the prosperity of Northern Ireland and people simply looking for a better society and a better life?
Joe, absolutely, absolutely. So if I can be really, this sounds a bit brutal, but if you imagine there was in a border poll that the nationalists and the unionists will sort of cancel each other out. Those people who today will vote on emotive issues and really whatever happens in a campaign are not going to change that point of view, right? If you imagine they will cancel each other out. So the future of Northern Ireland and Ireland, the constitutional future, is going to be decided by those in the middle. Like every general election in the UK, because we've essentially got a two-party state, it's going to be decided by those people who are persuadable. So the moderate unionists, the moderate nationalists, those who don't see themselves as either unionist or nationalist, those are very often younger people. They're very often a bit better educated people. And this is a growing number of people. You know, a lot of people in Northern Ireland on both sides, they haven't been, it's 2 generations since they went to church every Sunday like they did when I was growing up. And so there's a big, you know, and there's a lot of people who've grown up since the Good Friday Agreement. You know, you're talking about 30-year-olds who don't remember violence in Northern Ireland. That is an amazing thing. But those people, just as Jim was saying, they're looking at different things. They're looking at economics. They look to Dublin often, and they like what they see, because compared to Stormont, it looks like a much more open, a much more liberal society. That's a positive. Often those people like the EU, the vast majority of those people voted to remain in the EU. So becoming part of the EU is something that's very attractive. However, there is a massive issue with the idea of prosperity and economics. Public service sector in Northern Ireland is a massive employer. So what's going to happen to all those jobs? What's going to happen to the people's pensions who have those jobs? What about education? What about the NHS, which is, despite the fact that there have been quite a lot of issues over the NHS in the North, it's still something that's prized, and there is some concern about what would happen. What does the future look like? And people in Northern Ireland, the middle ground, who aren't voting on historical terms, are really going to want a proper blueprint. They want to know what their lives are going to look like. They want to know what their kids' lives are going to look like. And they really are going to want detail. The opposite of what happened with Brexit, where people voted and then we found out what was going to happen. It needs to be the other way around this time. And for it to be successful, and for a vote to go in favour of change, the people in the middle will need to know what that change might be. They will also need to, and this is a political point, they'll need to feel that they're not voting for Sinn Féin, because the people in the middle ground, the people that will be needed to take that vote over the line, are not Sinn Féin supporters. And neither are they DUP supporters, but they would need to feel that they are voting for an all-Ireland that is inclusive for all of them, and that they're not voting for Sinn Féin. So if it was purely a Sinn Féin-headed referendum campaign, I think they would struggle to make it successful.
Paul, can I bring you in here on the border? Obviously, the virus doesn't recognise borders. What type of progress have you seen on North-South cooperation, and is there opportunity for more progress to be made?
Yeah, Joe, obviously I always try to avoid political commentary in my role, but sometimes it hasn't stopped me in the past either, but it usually gets me into trouble. But I would just make a couple of comments on it. I think, and Andrea's closeness to all of this is really remarkable and insightful. But I think from our perspective, from a health system perspective, I think the instability, I guess, in Northern politics hasn't been helpful at the peak of the pandemic. I think the fact that we're such a small island makes it really difficult from a virus perspective. When you start talking about things like quarantining and borders, it's really very difficult. It makes it more difficult than it already is. And I know there's good North-South relationships at a political level, but there are still two different perspectives, and there has been through the pandemic in relation to how to tackle the virus. So that's just stating the facts. I guess if you go below that and get a health system level, we have kind of probably works at three levels. Certainly a political to political level through the North-South dialogue, and the ministers would be where a lot of dialogue has happened, and we have leverage that and try to influence that from our perspective. I guess then at a health level, there would be good engagement between two departments or two CMOs, chief medical officers, engaging on approaches to the virus and learnings and knowledge. And then equally, actually importantly, which probably doesn't get above the radar, at an operating level, there's very significant cooperation between North-South and health systems pre-pandemic, but particularly accelerated during the pandemic. So, we would have had a lot of discussions, dialogue, support. For example, when we go back to what we were all witnessing in Bergamo and the capacity of the Irish health system, North and South, we had a lot of dialogue around intensive care and how we would support each other on intensive bed capacity in intensive cares. And that was a weekly dialogue, particularly during this wave where North of Ireland got into real capacity issues on ICU, and on a daily basis our critical care teams were on dialogue every 12 o'clock every day, and I joined many of them every day to see how could we help at some stage on ICU, and we're tight also. So that was a cooperation, and equally when we got into real issues over the last few weeks on ICU, there was always that extended support from the Northern Health System, which was very refreshing. And then, even on an operating level, we saw a lot of some of the hospitals in the north become under real pressure with lots of queues of ambulance outside, and our own National Ambulance Service and the Ambulance Service Northern of Ireland had really good engagement, and we had crews up in the north regularly during the week and regularly throughout the weekends. So that was all really quite refreshing to see. So on operating level, I think there's really been good, significant progress and great relationships. It does make it difficult at a political level in terms of tackling the virus, and particularly in issues of borders.
It's interesting, a lot of the debate around Northern Ireland is a political one, but I think this conversation has shown that there's economic and very practical considerations like health that there can be more cooperation on, which perhaps is a path forward for Northern Ireland. I want to return back to the Barometer now and our overall theme of renewing society. And one of the important aspects of that is the need to tackle misinformation. So on issues like we've just discussed, such as the future of Northern Ireland, globalization, climate and racism, the truth, as we know, has never been more important or as difficult to find. The Barometer indicates the challenge. What you are looking at here is trust in information sources, which are at a record low. Trust in traditional media, search engines, owned and social media have all declined in the last year, and the most significant drop is in traditional media, down 11 points. Only 17% trust social media. There are also very challenging findings when it comes to news organizations. As you can see here, over 50% believe that journalists are trying to mislead them, and that news organizations are more concerned with supporting an ideology or a political position than they are with informing the public. 64% believe that the media is not doing well at being objective and non-partisan. There are also some interesting insights on personal behavior. Only 1 in 4 in Ireland are practicing what we call good information hygiene. That means they use multiple news sources, they avoid echo chambers, they verify that the information they're consuming is accurate, and they vet content before sharing it. So this means that there is a considerable amount of unvetted information being circulated, and personal behavior in terms of sorting fact from fiction is quite important. I'm going to come back to our panel on these findings. And Paul, if I can start with you, the rubber hits the road for you when you're dealing with media in relation to all of this. And it appears that media did wear the green jersey initially during the start of the pandemic. Is that still the case? And secondly, can I ask you, what has been the HSE's experience of dealing with social media and misinformation?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Two very real issues. If I go back to the very start of this pandemic, we had very good engagement with the national media organizations, and in fairness to all of them, they approached us and said they wanted to support us in terms of getting accurate information out. They wanted to play their part around building trust of the public and getting accurate information with ourselves to the public. So they made very direct approaches to us, and I met most of the CEOs of the major media organizations. So that was really welcome. They also supported us in terms of advertising and information getting out. So, you know, really, truly responsible media engagement with us, I should say, at the start. And I will finish off that piece by saying, and has held true, to be fair, throughout, you know, to even when it comes to things like vaccination programs now, to work with us in terms of getting accurate information out, being responsible. When information, just like last week, kind of emerges out around COVID and impacts and potential stillbirth impacts. It was a smaller number, you know, not fully proven data just yet. A lot of media pick up of it, and we were quite conscious of a lot of women being quite scared and hearing that. And in fairness to the media, they acted very responsibly and got a lot of really good medical commentators out reassuring the public. So I want to recognize that, first of all. But that doesn't mean it's been an easy ride or anything like it, or we haven't had fractious issues, or we haven't had, you know, issues raised that just really were inaccurate and from our perspective, and we have to challenge media companies on it. But one thing we did very earlier on just with media overall was from a HSE perspective, we set out that we were going to, in mid-January last year, do a weekly briefing throughout this pandemic, and we've held true to that. We originally did it every Sunday, because on a Sunday we could address the Sunday papers and what were happening. And now we do it every Thursday, few hours, we sit in front of the media and handle every question. And we feel that's very beneficial for us in HSE, and I know journalists feel it's very beneficial for them because they can tackle us front on and you know, with any issues that are emerging. So that's just to say that. The social media one is a really more difficult issue for us. We certainly have used it. We've used it to reach different populations. Our own social media accounts have just, you know, grown phenomenally. So we use TikTok, we use Instagram, we use Facebook and Twitter. I would say, and this is my experience, I use Twitter quite a lot. You know, there is a false world out there in social media sometimes that cannot truly reflect the reality. I give the example very briefly. I was in a vaccination centre last Saturday, all day Saturday, where we were vaccinating 80-year-olds and over, and 1,500 people were vaccinated on the day. And I spent my whole day just talking to people. And it was just sheer joy, sheer gratitude from the public and their family to the health system, to the HSE. And, you know, I spoke with hundreds of people on the day, and there was nothing, just gratitude. If you watch social media on that day, which I did, you would hear a whole different perspective, or you potentially could. So I think there's a real challenge for us to be resilient about what we're not doing. And this goes for politicians, to not get completely distracted by today's social media news, and, you know, just hold a bit firm, because health systems take longer. So summary answer, I think I would reflect pretty responsible but challenging journalism. Social media, you know, caution.
Jim, can I come to you on that caution in relation to social media? And the worst of social media, obviously we've seen it weaponized, be it in the US or perhaps in the UK. And there does seem to be this battleground opening up, Jim, between big tech and the regulatory state. Is it time to regulate social media companies? Is it possible to regulate them, or have they become untamable?
Well, Joe, I'd like to just step back a sec to put the context of giving you a more specific answer to what you asked me, and listening to Paul and how you framed it earlier. You know, in some ways, I often think this is right at the top of the biggest challenges facing all of us in the era in which we live. Modern technology and how we're doing this is just one example of it, gives this staggering access for everyone, or actually in this case, not everyone, but for billions and billions of people to get access to something. And by and large, it's a fantastic thing. But there is this huge, simple dilemma that all our brains think that translates into facts and knowledge. And some of it is subjective and some of it's not. And it's very complicated. And then two other things add to the complication. First of all, bang in the middle of it are our policymakers, including in democracies, elected ones, that have to live in this 24/7 world of responding to everything all the time, and indeed themselves get wrapped up in the whole sort of circus of it, which takes them down often their own weird path. I, for one, have never personally understood what the great merits of Twitter would be, for example. I've avoided the whole of my professional life. I don't really get why it's in the interest of a national policymaker to be on Twitter simply because it's fashionable and supposedly you reach more people. And I'm not picking on Twitter, I'm just citing that as an example. And then the additional complication is that a lot of news about anything is often subjective anyhow. I come from the world of economics and finance, and I would often say to young people working for me in my heyday at Goldman, never listen to anything you read in the Financial Times, which is not directed as being an insult at the Financial Times, but a lot of the journalists that would write about some news information in economics wouldn't necessarily have the right qualifications to actually understand. So I could go on and on about. So with all of that context, yes, I think the answer to your question specifically is quite easy. That if we have these major forms of social media as literally a minute to minute, an hour by hour, and day by day source of information, which is out competing with traditional sources because it's supposedly free, which, by the way, is a whole separate discussion, of course they should be regulated. It's pretty clear to me.
And those issues, Jim, that you've described with social media, and indeed you've touched on with traditional media as well. Andrea, can I bring you in here? And when you look at the trust issues that we see in the barometer around traditional media, what's behind that? What's happening with traditional media?
I mean, those are very striking issues and a real concern for traditional media. You know, I'm here to bang the drum, I suppose, for impartiality because, you know, I still believe it's incredibly important. And I think that when you've seen what has happened, for example, in the US, where you don't have, you know, a regulatory body trying to make sure that news is impartial, and I completely take Jim's point that everything is subjective to an extent, but when you have Fox on one side and MSNBC on the other side, and you can see the polarization, the extraordinary polarization in the US that, you know, led to the storming of the Capitol on the 6th of January, you realize perhaps that actually, although you might not think that state media, you know, like RTE or BBC, you know, everyone can complain about it and talk about its problems. But I think if you spend a year living in the US and looked at the television media anyway there, you might have a little bit more compassion and indeed pride in the media that at least attempts to be more impartial and toe that line. The big problem is, of course, you know, I think at one point in the pandemic, and Paul touched on this, I think many of us in mainstream media felt that this was going to actually be something that increased the credibility of public broadcasters and of you know, old media like, you know, ITV or the Times or RT or whatever, because people really needed trusted sources. And I think that I would say that I think we did a pretty good job doing that. And like Paul was saying, we got extremely good access in Britain, and I think in Ireland too, to politicians, perhaps more so than we're used to, because we really needed to get proper health messages across. So in a way, media broadcast was being used in maybe its more pure form to actually just disseminate important information rather than have too much commentary and politicizing. Our longer term problem is that a younger generation finds it much more difficult to, and why should they? They find it much more difficult to differentiate between an impartial, something that's a regulated body, like for example RTE, and stuff that they find elsewhere on the internet and in social media, because they use social media platforms to get all of their news. So you can get all of the traditional media on Facebook along with any opinion that anybody comes up with, and it's all coming to you in the same place. And so it's not like you're watching it on a traditional television set and watching, you know, 4 or 5 channels or whatever. So it's a huge challenge. It's the biggest challenge that journalism and that the owners of broadcast media face at the moment. There are lots of people trying very hard to come up with answers, but you know, your figures, frankly, are really, really worrying. And after a pandemic, the fact that trust is so low is extremely disappointing, and it does show that we've got an awful lot more to do. And if anyone had the answer to this, they'd be telling you in a much more simple way. There isn't a straightforward answer, but you know, I'm a firm believer that we need to have trusted sources of news. You know, it's what I've spent my life doing, and the fact that is disappearing should be a concern to all of us. And I think that even outside the media, we should be looking at ways to make sure that we know that we can provide people with news that they can believe and that they can trust. And we need to find new ways, perhaps, to make sure that people do trust the media more than they do at the moment.
It is one of the critical issues in terms of the health of our society, look presently and looking to the future. I want to return to our barometer and just look at the final area in terms of that idea of renewing society, and that is how the pandemic has showed in the most graphic way possible the dependency of the economy on public health. I wanted to discuss how we might build a stronger bridge between public health and economic wellness as we begin to emerge from the pandemic. Firstly, it appears that the public is already in this space, as their primary concern around the pandemic is an economic one. You'll see on the left of this chart, 74% are concerned about recession. Contracting COVID is not the primary concern of people. There are a range of other issues ahead of that. People are also showing that as the pandemic has developed and economic activity has slowed, vaccine hesitancy has receded. 77% are now willing to take the vaccine, an increase of 12% since November. Over the same period, the percentage of people who say they would take the vaccine immediately has doubled from 32% to 63%. We also looked at confidence in the economy, and it appears that the vaccination alone is not enough to build confidence. Only 50% believe that they will have more confidence as the vaccine progresses. One of the major hopes around economic activity was that those who have been able to save during the pandemic would begin to spend again. So it looks like savings behavior is well embedded. 65% say they still intend to save money even when the restrictions begin to ease. That's higher amongst under 30s. 81% in that group say they intend to save. So I want to come back to the panel here, and Jim, again, I want to come to you on this. You've done a lot of work in this area, and it appears that the pandemic is simply the warning shot, or could be the warning shot. And unless we deal with serious public health issues, like the threat of drug-resistant infections, then there is potentially worse to come. And as I said, you've done a lot of work in this area, Jim. I'd be interested in the threat landscape that you see ahead.
Thanks, Joe. Listen, fascinating to see these numbers that you show. Quite logical in my view. I could spend hours talking about this, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. Firstly, partly from my background in economics and finance, particularly crises, I am a very strong believer of the notion of never letting a crisis go to waste. And here in reality, we are experiencing the most savage economic crisis of any of our lifetimes, caused by something outside the economic system primarily, or at least without very indirect roots. And it's secondly, therefore, an enormous opportunity to for policymakers to stop thinking about health as a separate thing from economics and finance. Thirdly, as you touched on, probably the single most interesting thing I've ever done in my professional career was leading this independent review looking at the global challenge of antimicrobial resistance for the Cameron government. And that taught me that you cannot separate economics from health. And so I'm amongst the relatively few early on when this started. I was like, here you go. So the idea that we might lose 10 million people a year by 2050 because we run out of effective antibiotics perhaps no longer seems as idiotic as a lot of people accused, or a few of the people that took the time to look at the details of our review ended up saying might be what was the response. It's real. And so going back to my first point and making it my fourth one, I am heavily involved in a whole host of things. Probably the most interesting for an Irish audience in this regard is sitting on a WHO Europe-wide commission, independent one led by Mario Monti, in which we're trying to make the post-pandemic world better. And a week today, actually, we will come out, I hope, with our initial recommendations about trying to put in place a much better framework for when the next pandemic happens, because there will be another one, or how we're going to deal better with the growing challenge of antimicrobial resistance. And I just pray that we and others that are doing similar things have some ability to influence policymakers and we don't lose the moment, because this is an enormous opportunity to make something permanently better from the mess that we have gone through and are going through. And I could elaborate at great length about all of it.
Paul, just on that kind of threat landscape that Jim has described, and indeed the opportunity that presents itself to deal with that threat, how can you prepare the health services to deal with what lies ahead?
Yeah, it's interesting. I will kind of pick up on point Jim made there, because, you know, the interrelationship between health and the economy and society, I think everybody kind of gets it a lot better after what we've been through. And certainly during this pandemic, at the worst of it, you know, I may have differed from some of my health colleagues to the extent I was quite public by saying we have to understand the balance between, you know, the health and the required public health measures, the impact on the economy and the impact on society. And we did many studies about the impacts on children being out of school, or, you know, impacts on older people cocooning for so long. You know, so we tried to present a balanced piece. You know, we weren't just there saying, you know, lock it down, it's about the health system. Because, you know, when we look forward, you know, the funding of the health system is a really key one for us. You know, the capacity of the Irish state to fund the requirements of the health service in the coming years are key. So, you know, in terms of how we would address it, we made a very strong case through government for this is the time to enhance our investment in health this year and next year. And very positively, that's the support we've got. We've got a 21% extra budget for health in a year when every department and every sector, you know, is facing very difficult challenges on their funding. You know, so a 21% uplift to over 20 billion, an extra 3.5 billion euros. Some of it to continued protections against COVID, but half of it extra to invest in new services, enhanced services, keeping people out of the hospital system, getting treatment away, a very new role for our national ambulance services, not just a 24-hour paramedic response, but treating people at home, giving care outside in the community, a very new way of doing outpatients, not having to go to a hospital system, doing outpatients in a new way, a very new way for our GPs to work with the health system, getting access to diagnostics outside of the health system, a very new way of looking at care for older people, and not just about saying caring for them at home, but having multidisciplinary teams coming out of our hospital system, geriatricians, and working with people in their homes. A very new way of looking at national health systems, and a way of, a strategic way and policy way that we need to look at elderly people in congregated settings, or indeed congregated settings in themselves have proven not a place to be in a pandemic. So from our perspective, there are very few big policy issues emerging from this that government are, you know, we will advise government on, government will think about, you know, policy direction, investment, and keeping people safer. But on the kind of interrelationship that we do this, it'll be good for the economy. It's not just we do this, you sustain it, we're looking for more money. So I think certainly as CEO of the HSE, I want to continue that dialogue of the relationship between the economy, finances, economy, health system and society.
Andrea, it's clear from Jim and Paul's contributions there that policy change and investment is required to deal with the future, but there's also a reality that whether it's dealing with climate change or whether it's dealing with the next pandemic, it's going to take personal sacrifice and change on the part of people. How do we persuade people to change behaviour, and what messages might they be open to?
It's very interesting listening both to Jim and Paul there, because I think that, you know, I'm spending a lot of time right now. I'm working on a series looking at this whole idea of what the future holds in all these areas. You know, what is the future? How do we, as Jim said, you know, how do we take this crisis and make the best of it? You know, what is the future of education? What, you know, what should we be looking at in terms of jobs and offices? And But in terms of how people will change in a positive way, what policy can do to enhance that, partly, of course, personal behavior changes through peer pressure, societal pressure. You know, if you think about things like drink driving or wearing seatbelts, you know, it may be that environmentally it seems antisocial in the future to go on multiple city breaks all over Europe, you know, jumping on a plane every 10 minutes. I think that work-wise, it will seem very strange to be, you know, hopping over to London from Dublin twice a week or whatever. And so those kind of changes come about through societal pressure. They may have been there a little bit already, but they will continue to be, and I think they will be a lot more prevalent. For companies, they'll be looking at their ESG and thinking, actually, we can't possibly have all these flights on our books this time next year. If things cost people money, though, you know, if it actually affects their bank balance, particularly at a time where, although some people have done okay, you know, out of the pandemic because they haven't been spending and they have still been earning. For a lot of people in society, you know, they're very concerned about their jobs, about their position, about their future. And so the idea of being more environmentally friendly is great as long as it's not really affecting your bank balance too negatively. But that really is a great opportunity for governments, if they've got the kind of headspace after this pandemic, to try and think a little bit more creatively about, you know, offering loans for solar panels or incentives to drive electric cars. How do we make people work from home, which will also be a lot more environmentally friendly? What are the ways of flexible working that allow people to have the interaction that I think we're all desperate to have with people again in offices, and to help build relationships, but also perhaps that will allow people working from home a more balanced working life, which will also be good for a lot across the board, will be good for women. And also allow people to be more environmentally friendly because they won't be commuting all the time, and they perhaps won't be having such big office spaces. So there are lots of ways in which we can make changes. Some of them will just be you know, individuals making personal choices, but that has to fit into a framework of them feeling that those choices are evaluated, that they can work out how they make a difference, because it's difficult for people to make a sacrifice if they're not quite sure if it's actually going to make an overall change to the well-being of our society. There's loads of opportunities here, but we do need a kind of an overarching policy as well. It's not just about individuals.
Change is constant. I think that's the story of the next number of years for us. We're coming up on an hour, so I'm going to conclude here, but just some concluding remarks from me. I think when we look at the renewal of our society and our economy, it's not possible without trust. There is a Latin phrase, solvitur ambulando, meaning we solve as we walk. That's very much been the case with the pandemic, and it is also the case with trust. It is in the everyday institutions of people, everyday actions of people and institutions that trust is earned or lost. I'm happy to engage separately with anybody who's interested in the methodologies that we use at Edelman to help organizations build and sustain trust. For now, I want to thank our partners in the Institute of Directors and the Marketing Institute. I really want to thank Jim, Andrea and Paul for your time and for your fantastic insights. I really appreciate that you've taken the time to join us. And finally, I want to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. I hope you have a good day, and thank you. Bye-bye.